Michal Kotler-Wunsch is the representative, the envoy for combating anti-Semitism for the State of Israel, also a former member of Knesset for the center-left Blue and White Party. Michal, thank you so much for joining us here at the Media Line today.
Thank you so much for having me, Felice.
It's 2025, and it's really hard to believe that we're discussing that there needs to be an envoy for anti-Semitism. What does that role mean?
So actually, thank you for presenting it in that way, because I often say it's truly unbelievable that not just Israel had to appoint a special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, but actually Israel was a little bit late in the game in appointing this role. And everybody should know that in the last 5 to 10 years, many countries have appointed special envoys for combating anti-Semitism. I'm about one of 35 such special envoys from around the world. People who were appointed as special envoys were appointed because of the gradual, and I will say, rise in anti-Semitism that exploded in the aftermath of October the 7th.
To that point, I'd like to ask the question, did people fail to see the anti-Semitism? It's not that it just emerged, and as you stated.
The thing about anti-Semitism, I often describe it as an ever-mutating virus, quoting the late Rabbi Sachs, who explained very, very well that anti-Semitism mutates by latching onto the guiding social construct of the time: religion, science, and the secular religion of our times, human rights, which I guess brings me into the picture as Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism as a human rights or international law specialist. The understanding that anti-Semitism did not die in Auschwitz, it just mutated, is one of the first and most important things to understand.
You have warned about a double standard that's applied to Israel as part of unconventional warfare, stating wars need to be funded to be fought. Who or what provides the oxygen for this new virulent anti-Semitism?
So thanks for asking that, Felice, because it's critical that we understand this has been a decades-long, what I call the eighth front, actually intent to demonize and delegitimize and apply double standards to the Jew among the nations, that is, the State of Israel. We have to understand, and if we track the hijacking and weaponization of the international institutions and principles and mechanisms, including the UN itself, starting with a 1975 UN resolution, Zionism is racism, Soviet propaganda, Zionism is racism, actually alive and well on 2024, soon 2025 university campuses, Zionism is racism, is what I would call the opening shot in this unconventional war for public opinion that has been raging for now 49, soon to be 50 years. Blood libel number one is, of course, Israel's an apartheid state. In the aftermath of the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism that turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest, after which, for the last 23 years, soon to be 24 years, there have been Israel apartheid weeks on nearly every single campus across North America. So blood libel number one in this unconventional war for public opinion, 1975, Zionism is racism. Blood libel number two, 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism turned anti-Semitic hate fest that then peddles Israel's an apartheid state. And blood libel number three, I would say the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law. The one that accuses the State of Israel, the Jew among the nations, the single Jewish nation state, of perpetrating genocide, a term coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was annihilated in the Holocaust, for the creation of a convention for the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, utilized by none other than South Africa, in none other than the International Court of Justice, to accuse the State of Israel of perpetrating genocide, even as it defends itself from genocidal, openly declared intent of Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and of course the Islamic Republic of Iran, of which they are all but proxies, openly declaring its intent, morning and night, to annihilate the State of Israel and murder Jews and actually perpetrate genocide in the aftermath of October 7th, war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I want to point out that, Michal, your position is a volunteer position, and all that you are espousing is a lot of effort that goes into everything that you have to work against every single day. To that end, which is really important, I was in London witnessing the tens of thousands of marchers that were orchestrated, their chants, the cadence, the rhythms, the plans, posters, and signs that were handed out calling for boycotts of Coca-Cola, boycotts of Barclays Bank, Who is funding this operation?
So we know more and more, actually, on the streets, online, in universities, by the way. There are billions of dollars, Qatari dollars, that have flowed into American universities to enable this, I'm going to say, diminishing of what should be academic freedom and free speech, and instead was translated in a post-October 7th reality where there could have been, presumably, nothing but an unequivocal condemnation, what is a series of protests and encampments and chants of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which we understand is just an echoing of the Hamas charter that calls for the annihilation of the State of Israel, and the understanding that it is foreign funding, including the Islamic Republic of Iran, including Qatar, including others who have, I'm going to say, dabbled, some in utilitarian anti-Semitism, that has enabled the tsunami that has translated to the targeting of individual Jews around the world, of individual corporations, of individual supporters of the State of Israel. If we look at congressmen like Richie Torres, who self-define as Zionists or are identified to be Zionists, they too are the legitimate, so to speak, target of this new form, mainstream form of an ever-mutating lethal hate. And in that sense, the State of Israel too, the nation state of the Jewish people, has an incredibly important role, together with countries around the world that recognize that anti-Semitism is indeed but the first sign or but the predictor of what threatens, and there is a rising threat to humanity, to freedom, and to the dignity of difference. The State of Israel too needs to treat this as an eighth war front, literally a war that is intent to annihilate the State of Israel and murder Jews around the world. And in that sense, indeed, I have carried this position. I was appointed about 3 weeks before October the 7th, and I've carried on in this position in a voluntary capacity because it is a war. And in that sense, it is the only war that I know how to fight. I have been grateful for partners around the world that have invited me to speak and address this issue, including meeting with my counterparts around the world, including global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism that we adopted just in last July in Argentina in the 30-year anniversary commemorating the Amia bombing. Again, we have this a string of anti-Semitism that has to be connected, if you will, connecting the dots. And it is insufficient that we do so voluntarily and on a whack-a-mole basis. What has happened in a post-October 7th world is that many masks were ripped off that exposed the intersection between what has been festering for decades in the international institutions, in the academic spaces, in the social media spaces. And if we do not create a holistic strategy, not reactive, but proactive, not whack-a-mole, but something that can identify and address anti-Semitism holistically. And I mentioned before, the only way to do that is with a definition, a comprehensive definition that enables to identify all of the strains of what is an ever-mutating virus. That is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It is a working definition that needs to be utilized. It is a resource, but it is the single resource that has been proven for accuracy with the responses to October the 7th, right? Responses of silence, me too, unless you're a Jew. Responses of denial that began on October the 7th, even while the barbaric savages that perpetrated the atrocities live-streamed the war crimes and crimes against humanity of October the 7th. Responses of justification. Rape as armed resistance. Judith Butler, who I studied in law school, explaining, and students echoing that resistance is justified. And of course, responses that have attacked Jews or Zionists around the world and have seen as a legitimate target to attack them in response to the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust. So nothing has made more clear and more urgent the utilization of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And we should know that we face backlash on that IRA definition precisely because of its accuracy and its ability to identify and combat all strains of this ever-mutating virus.
One of the most dangerous fallouts of anti-Semitism is that of those feeling isolationism. And frankly, Michal, you are having young Jews on university campuses feeling alone, feeling they can't even go to their classes, seeing, as we have seen in Canada, Dawson College close classes for a day because of demonstrations. Again, it goes back to almost 2025. Hard to believe it's almost 1930.
So that is actually one of the most devastating pieces, right? The individual, at the end of the day, isolated, and as part of the responses to October the 7th, no less. The individual, as I said, targeted. The individual not just feeling, but knowing that the institutions, including universities in which they are students, do not apply their rules consistently or equally to them. Meaning rules that exist in universities are not applied to David, who happens to be a Jew, or Sally, who happens to be a Zionist, or Fred, who just believes Israel has a right to exist, because of the proliferation of this pernicious hate systemically and systematically into the institutions that have failed to apply their own policies. That isolation is what I call the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. That is precisely what the lack of unequivocal condemnation on the day after October the 7th, without a but at the end of the sentence, whether by legislators, by university presidents, by mayors, by any statement that was issued, the moment that there was a false moral equivalence between a genocidal, barbaric, war crime and crime against humanity perpetrating that murdered 1,200 people, that abducted 251 people, that raped and burned alive and traumatized entire communities along the border that they infiltrated, the moment that there was a but at the end of the sentence, and by the way, in the name of progress. So not only did we see and witness on that day the most barbaric atrocities akin to Middle Ages regress, but we saw the inability to unequivocally condemn them in the name of, so to speak, progress. That has been the most, I'm going to say, pernicious manifestation of this tsunami of anti-Semitism, and the isolation that you speak about is a part of the mainstreaming of that anti-Semitism that actually allowed it to completely become, if you will, unleashed. So the genie being let out of the bottle that has become legitimate to attack individuals, regents in universities, individuals, as you said, students on their campuses, prevented from passing through an encampment, so to speak, because they are Zionists. And I should share with you that when I enter campuses, very often, or until October the 7th, the sign on the sidewalk of New York City in big pink chalk letters said, "Zionists not welcome." Except that I am a Zionist. It's my identity. I cannot shed my Zionist pound of flesh. And when you think of that 20-year-old student, Jew or non-Jew, by the way, that is told, if you just shed that Zionist pound of flesh, that for thousands of years your ancestors have prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion, if you just shed that pound of flesh, that part of your identity, you could be a good person. You can understand why there are many Jewish students at the forefront, and very often they are actually the first student that I meet in the protests against me, at the forefront of what has become, I'm going to say, stolen from the Jewish story. And I often remind ourselves, Israel doesn't exist because the Holocaust occurred, which is usually sort of part and parcel of the argument that we were sent here by European colonizers in the aftermath of the Holocaust as some sort of a reparation prize for the genocide, because it has meaning as opposed to the Amnesty report that just redefined it, for the genocide of 6 million Jews. That's not why Israel exists. Israel is the nation state of Jews, a prototypical indigenous people. Why prototypical indigenous? That speaks the same language, Hebrew, that reads the same book, the Bible, that was desecrated on October the 7th, Shabbat Simchat Torah, that traverses the same land, Israel, that hearkens to the same prophets and practices the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. That's what indigeneity means. But if the story of the Jewish people has been stolen from us by imposing irrelevant social constructs on our story, so that in today's North American campus, Jews are considered hyper-white. According to the alt-right, Jews will not replace us, we will never be right enough. According to the alt-left, woke, sort of intersecting oppressed and oppressor, victimizing stories, Jewish students are told that they are hyper-white, but that story is not relevant to the Jewish story.
So, Michal, looking at the organizations like the United Nations, are they anti-Semitic by nature? Is the body itself anti-Semitic? Or is that the people who join align with anti-Semitism itself?
So I'm gonna say very, very clearly, look, so we're just marking 76 years to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written in the blood and the ash of 6 million Jews and in the aftermath of World War II. It was intent to ensure that never again would atrocities too terrible to imagine but not too terrible to have happened recur in a world of again and again, right? We look at Sudan, we look at China, we look at egregious human rights violations being perpetrated as we speak, and then we look at the UN. And what has happened to the UN, and again I'm going to say anti-Semitism is just a symptom of it, is the consistent hijacking and weaponization and the consistent hijacking and weaponization to delegitimize and demonize and apply double standards to the Jew among the nations. That doesn't just impact the Jew among the nations, the state of Israel. That collapses the entire infrastructure. If you apply any principle selectively, that's what double standards are, or invented standards are, it's no longer worth the paper it's written on. And when the UN has around its Human Rights Commission table the most egregious violators of human rights, China and Iran, and many of the other, as I said, most egregious violators of human rights, and in the name of some sort of new principle that's being invented, only calls out one state actually regularly, every single year, for more human rights violations than all countries together in the world, then the double standard has collapsed the entire infrastructure. Anti-Semitism is a manifestation of that. It's both the fuel and the result, if you will, or the manifestation. And it's not the institution that has turned anti-Semitic. It's the institution that it's rendered itself actually absolutely useless. It's an institution and its agencies, the ICC, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court, those were meant to be courts of last resort. If they overlook or ignore the very principles they were founded on, justiciability, complementarity, many legal terms that the court completely overlooked when it accused the Israeli Prime Minister and former defense minister of the most egregious crimes perpetrated by humans to other humans, then those agencies, those mechanisms become completely obsolete as well, and then they will fail to collapse anybody else in the world, meaning it's the entire mine shaft that the canary or the bloody canary in the mine shaft gives a bit of a heads up to if you're tracking the bloody canary in the mine shaft. The collapse of the mine shaft, again, enables the perpetrating of the worst crimes known to mankind, war crimes and crimes against humanity, again and again, because those principles can no longer protect anybody. And so this is not just an existential moment for the state of Israel, the Jew among the nations. This is not just an existential moment for Jews around the world attacked by the very same anti-Semitism that fueled the atrocities of October the 7th and the multi-front war that has been raging since. But this is actually an existential moment for humanity, if you will, because if those infrastructures created fail to protect humanity, then it is an existential moment for all that believe in humanity and freedom.
Like father, like daughter, Michal Kotler-Wunsch is the daughter of the esteemed minister Erwin Kotler, who himself is going through a spate of anti-Semitism where he is under house arrest, quite frankly, in a way, where he can't go anywhere without police escort. Michal, what is going on in Canada?
So Canada, like many of the other countries I've just mentioned in which there is a tsunami of anti-Semitism, has also enabled this transnational aggression of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And indeed, you're right that my dad, a former justice minister, and perhaps in this context more importantly, a human rights warrior that fought for the freedom of thousands of people around the world, is essentially under house arrest with 24-hour police protection. And in order to be able to leave the house has to have, be accompanied everywhere that he goes. The understanding that what we have enabled in democracies around the world is the emboldening of not just the proxies of authoritarian, theocratic, murderous regimes like the Islamic regime in Iran. Not just the proxies have been emboldened, and I mentioned some of them, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, but actually the regimes themselves. If you enable genocidal terror and you enable the authoritarian undermining of human rights, of that infrastructure, while benefiting from it with sitting around the table at the UN that we just mentioned, with receiving international humanitarian aid, if you enable that, you embolden it everywhere. And Canada, like many of the other democracies, is actually in many ways manifesting in that threat of democracy's strengths being identified as weaknesses by the enemies of democracy and utilizing them to collapse them from within. And that is indeed the sort of case that you mentioned of my own father. It's devastating on a personal level.
The role of the media is absolutely paramount at this point. Speaking of the foreign press, are they utilizing these significant events to their favor? And are they not playing up the proper amounts of anti-Semitism when they should be mentioned to the public?
So here's the heartbreaking piece of the legacy media for me, and actually we would be remiss if we didn't mention in a social media era, right? Imagine if 11 days after 9/11, the New York Times would have posted on its front page evidence given to it by Al-Qaeda. Well, that's precisely what happened 11 days after 10/7, an attack of barbarism on civilization, just like 9/11. But 11 days after October the 7th, after 10/7, in fact, the New York Times published on its front page allegations made by Hamas, the equivalent of Al-Qaeda, a genocidal terror organization, that Israel had bombed a hospital. And we remember that very well on the front page. Of course, that went viral and around the world. And by the time we found out, oops, that it was an errant rocket launched by none other than Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another genocidal terror organization, it was too late because the information had gotten out in that way. And the failing of legacy media at this moment, for me, is one of the greatest tragedies of our time. Because never I think in certainly modern history, has the importance of legacy media as watchdog of democracy been more pronounced, and never have we seen more failings over and over again across networks. And I don't want to single one out. Believe me that we can mention here the regurgitation of Hamas Health Ministry data on BBC, on CNN, on many, many of the legacy media channels, and the understanding that that false moral equivalence, as I said before, has just emboldened those that are threatening democracy rather than being the watchdog of democracy is of the most devastating sign of our times.
Students for Justice of Palestine have just handed out 1,000 copies of a freshly printed newspaper about what they believe in and which clearly is anti-Israel. What is happening in Colombia? Why are we not seeing the administration, the deans, the provosts, the board pushing back and pushing back quickly on these initiatives?
Just because you call something for justice or for human rights, it doesn't mean that it's for justice or for human rights. And how do I know? Because Students for Justice in Palestine are not for Palestinians. If they were for Palestinians, they'd be taking to the streets screaming to free Palestinians for Hamas, and to free the people of Lebanon from Hezbollah, and to free the people of Iran from the Islamic Republic of Iran. In fact, what they're protesting for is we are Hamas, from the river to the sea, echoing the Hamas Charter, and glory to our martyrs days after October the 7th. And we have to be very, very clear about what has happened at universities. Look, we know that millions and millions of dollars have poured in, and you mentioned Colombia. We actually know that Qatari dollars have fueled whatever it is that's happening on campus today and continue to do so, and other foreign agents. The thing is, and I say this very often to university presidents with whom I meet, including the 3 that appeared in Congress, the thing is that this is a moment of reckoning for academic spaces too. University spaces are going to have to decide if their mission is to teach people how to think, which is why I went to law school, or if their mission is to teach people what to think, which is a very dangerous prospect and actually echoes 1930s in a not so recent past. And the understanding that it is universities' moment of reckoning at this time that fail, as I said before, to apply their own policies, whether it's a no megaphone policy at protests, when there are certainly megaphones at every single protest I've seen, or whether it's other policies that actually are forbidding to harass and bully and intimidate any students, except for those Jew/Zionist students and faculty, or whether it is the commitment to academic freedom and rigor that we have seen absent, that enables to bring guest speakers like Francesca Albanese, who is a rabid anti-Semite, but cancel the son of Hamas, who is scheduled to speak. And the worst part of it is because, and the reason very often is, because we can't actually make sure that you are secure We can't ensure your security. That's the new going standard line. That Jews are actually told to remove their kippahs or their Magen David or hide their identity because the police or the campus security or whoever it is that's mandated to apply policies not only can't do it, but refuses to try. That, for me, is actually a part and parcel of this mainstreaming of anti-Semitism that endangers those spaces, that actually endangers the academic freedom and the freedom of speech, not just of Jewish students, not just of Zionist students, and not just in certain faculties. And we see a creeping sort of mechanism into what I would call the final frontier, which is law schools where it started, I would argue, which is medical schools, right? Which is the sciences, the understanding that that is the final frontier. And we now have lists of doctors who can no longer work in the public sector in Canada and the United States, organizing themselves to be able to, echoing again dark times in history, to be able to administer healthcare. That is a very, very dangerous manifestation in democracies.
You're bringing up double standards. Why don't we take a look at those that are actually doing it right? There are universities that have taken a stand, that are calling out anti-Semitism. Maybe not enough, but you're seeing it as well where there is some pushback. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's true for universities, it's true for the international institutions, it's true for the social media spaces, it's true for any corporation. There is a definition of anti-Semitism that enables to identify and combat all of its strains. You cannot combat something without identifying it. And you cannot identify just some strains of an ever-mutating virus. So you have the older strains, and maybe you've inoculated your society against Holocaust denial or other strains of anti-Semitism. But this new pernicious mainstream strain that is anti-Zionism, that is the negation of Israel's very right to exist, that has done so by systematically demonizing and delegitimizing and applying double standards. Whether it's Dreyfus, the individual Jew, barred from an equal place in society, or the Jewish nation state, the single and only Jewish country, barred from an equal place in the family of nations, it requires a definition. So universities that have adopted and are utilizing, not just universities, corporations and others, and I'll give a really good example of that in a moment, are utilizing the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a long democratic process that was created precisely as the resource that it is to identify all of the strains of this ever-mutating virus, is the key. And just to give a small anecdotal example, it's actually a very simple one. After the riots in Montreal just a little over 2 weeks ago, a Second Cup franchisee that was actually caught on film, not only demonstrating her anti-Semitism but doing so by doing a Heil Hitler. She was the franchisee of Second Cup, it's a coffee chain, in the Jewish General Hospital. Again, anecdotally, the Jewish General Hospital, founded in 1933 because Jewish doctors couldn't get a job anywhere in Canada because they were Jews. She was the franchisee in the Jewish General Hospital, which of course services everybody today in a 2024 reality. That night, Second Cup issued a very clear statement, unequivocal, because that was a violation of the company's policies against hate, against intimidation, against harassment. The violation of policies has to be immediately and unequivocally called out and acted upon. And that is the key, including in universities, including in every other space that we have seen the silence, the indifference, the neutrality, and the false moral equivalence that has actually enabled the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism.
Here at the Media Line, we speak about anti-Semitism and hate. And to that point, there were 2 young kids that were shot at a Christian university because a maniac decided, in the name of genocide, that he was having a revenge attack. Now, how do you address that to the global audience and understanding this wasn't against the Jew, it wasn't against the Israeli, it was against 2 innocent Christian students, ages 5 and 6.
It's very important. I was going to say, young children. This is what I mean when I quote the late Rabbi Sachs, in that anti-Semitism is just the most reliable sign of a rising threat, I'm going to say now a major threat, to humanity and to freedom and to the dignity of difference. This is not an issue for Jews. By the way, just as anti-Black racism is not an issue for Blacks alone to combat, just as any other form of hate would not be expected to be fought by the subject of that hate. Anti-Semitism is no different. We should not apply double standards on ourselves. Anti-Semitism is not any different. Jews and the Jewish nation state will not be able to combat this strain of anti-Semitism, and nothing makes the case more clearly than non-Jews being attacked for some alleged crime that has actually been redefined, including, by Amnesty International, an alleged human rights organization, to suit the fact that we are going to accuse the Jew among the nations of the worst crime perpetrated ever in the history of mankind. So the understanding that we have now symptoms of the multiple masks that have been removed, but we must connect the dots and understand this moment as I said before, an existential moment for all of us that happen to hold dear our civilization and our shared humanity. And that anti-Semitism, because, in the words of the late Professor Wistrich, is the oldest hatred in the world. It has just existed for thousands of years because the Jewish people have. It enables us to actually identify what ails and what threatens our shared societies, our shared humanity. And nothing more clear than, if we remember the immediate responses to October 7th, made the urgency of this more available, or should be more available and accessible across spaces and places, not just to Jews, actually transcending any real or perceived differences of geography, of religion, of denomination, of faith, and understanding that this is actually a shared challenge that we face at this very, very difficult moment for democracies everywhere, but of which anti-Semitism is just a manifestation. In many cases, those 2 children that were targeted, that should have been the backlash. Again, if we were fighting for freedom, if we were fighting for human rights, that should have alerted the streets, where we have seen demonstrations, just as so many other moments in the last 14 months, should have alerted the streets to say, we are at a real existential moment. The sirens are ringing, and you mentioned some of those examples. My own father under house arrest. I could say demonstrations the day after 6 hostages, one of them an American Israeli, were shot to the back of the head. Instead of there being protests in the street to let them go, utilizing every single leverage that democracies or Western powers have, what we saw, including in New York City, where I was that day, is the exact opposite protests in support of Hamas, in support of those that perpetrated those crimes of October the 7th. And we have more and more and more examples of this against non-Jews as well. The understanding that we have to work together in order to be able to, in many ways, put this genie back in the bottle if we're to succeed. That's another example that highlights that.
The State of Israel, by its sheer existence, unfortunately, has created a lot of anti-Semitism. But looking at the media itself in Israel, looking at the people in Israel, do they understand anti-Semitism? Do they understand the importance of speaking about it and learning it and understanding that it needs to be told? The stories need to be told.
I just want to start with a clarification. There was never a justification for anti-Semitism. The fact that the State of Israel exists, that is not a justification for anti-Semitism, just as the fact that a Jew exists, Dreyfus, is not a justification for anti-Semitism. The understanding that anti-Semitism has persisted and created this new strain that targets the State of Israel is actually what enables us, and I'm going to say what demands of us as the Jewish nation state and as Israelis, to understand what it is that, as I said before, the same lethal hate that fueled the atrocities of October the 7th and the multi-front war that was waged on the day after October the 7th is the anti-Semitism that fuels the responses to that October 7th massacre and the multi-front war raging since. The responses, as I mentioned, of silence and of denial and of justification and of attack of Jews around the world. If the State of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, does not understand that this is part and parcel of the multiple fronts, this being the 8th front, that have actually been unleashed. So after a series of conventional wars from 1948, from the moment of return of the Jewish people to our ancestral homeland, 1948 to 1973, after a series of conventional wars failed in their openly declared intent to destroy the State of Israel, this unconventional war for public opinion was launched. And it was launched fully, openly admitting that it was going to hijack and weaponize international law and its institutions and the human rights mechanisms. It is very critical at the 76-year-old miracle that is the State of Israel. It is very critical that 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 the State of Israel too identify this as a war, as not just something that we are going to be able to respond to in this whack-a-mole way, or what we call hasbara, right? A word I do not actually appreciate very much. I think it's a manifestation of the fact that we don't understand this is a war. We don't fight a war by explaining ourselves. We fight a war with the tools that are used against us. And in that sense, I think that we are at an intersection where the State of Israel too understands clearly, but has to take responsibility for what it is that's happening to the 45% of Jews that are in North America and the 10% in the rest of the world, because only 45% of us are here in the nation state of the Jewish people. And we are actually experiencing this onslaught as a people. The 45% that are here in Israel, the 45% that are in North America, and the 10% in the rest of the world are actually experiencing this onslaught of hate, lethal hate, together, and we have to combat it together.
The Jews around the world are really a dot in relationship to the global population. Is there room for dialogue left? Can Israelis and Palestinians continue to talk about this war and move forward? Can Americans and Canadians and Europeans openly discuss on their campuses what is transpiring on a day-to-day basis and have civil discourse?
Not only can, but must. We have to be very clear about that. I'll share that I was a member of Knesset in 2020 when we signed the Abraham Accords. And at the time, I referred to the potential paradigmal shift that was inherent to the Abraham Accords. Because right around at the same time of Zionism as racism at the UN were the three no's of Khartoum, for those that remember them. No to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, and no to peace with Israel. Well, came the Abraham Accords and flipped from the three no's of Khartoum to the three yeses of the Abraham Accords, to recognition of the State of Israel as what it was founded to be, the Jewish nation state, of negotiation with Israel, ultimately, hopefully, with prayers, paving the path to peace. And I would say for all peoples in the region, the Palestinians included. And if you note, the first step in that process is recognition. You can't first actually broker peace, although we've been told over and over to try, broker peace, then negotiate the terms of the peace, and then see if we recognize each other's right to exist. That cannot work, not in a human relationship, not between countries, and not in an international setting. There has to be this hope that the Abraham Accords actually held within it, and that is that we recognize each other's right to exist as a first step that enables negotiation to our coexistence, paving ultimately the path to peace, including with the Palestinians. And for that, there not only needs to be a Palestinian leadership that, on October 8th, would have said, not in my name, not just that, but there has to be international community expectation of agency of the Palestinians. The understanding that the Palestinians get this get out of jail free card actually strips them of agency. The understanding that we expect nothing of Palestinian leadership, and that it's somehow legitimate to continue to indoctrinate with anti-Semitic hate, to continue to pay to slay Jews, literally funded by the international community with a terror infrastructure, as we know, underneath Gaza. That does not do justice to the Palestinian children. That actually disenables a better future between Palestinians and Israel. And I would say our conversation has to be with Western democracies, with Western powers that are bound by international law and human rights, and in many ways have not expected the very same, or so the flip of the double standard is, have not expected the same standard of the Palestinians, not only inventing standards for Israel or holding Israel to a different standard or applying standards selectively when it comes to Israel, but doing the very same thing to the Palestinians, holding them to a different standard or inventing a standard or not applying existing standards to them. And I'll give an example. UNRWA. My example of UNRWA, funded by European countries, by Western democracies. UNRWA is an agency that was created in sin for one single group of refugees, while all other refugees in the world have another refugee agency. And UNRWA is the single refugee agency that hands down refugee status from generation to generation to generation. We are now on fifth generation refugees. The understanding that if we treat the Palestinians differently than all other peoples in the world, we are doing them no favor, and we are actually entrapping them in this lack of ability to take their own future into their hands, is part and parcel of what we need to continue dialoguing on. We must continue dialoguing on and making accessible, including to our allies across the world.
The Pandora's box of anti-Semitism has been opened, and in a way that no one has dreamed, in universities, on organizations, on the streets around the world. Michal Kotler, wish you much success as an envoy dealing with anti-Semitism every single day. And thank you for really giving us facts and huge information and understanding what anti-Semitism is really about today.
Thank you. Thank you, Felice. And I often say it's a never again is now moment.